So welcome everyone and welcome Kat. Kat's here today and she's going to give us a talk on the upcoming changes to regulations around research involving human participants. So Kat is the GCP training manager at Health and Care Research Wales. She manages the research training programme across Wales and works collaboratively with the NIHR as part of their GCP Leads group. Kat is passionate about the impact high quality training can make to research delivery and ultimately to the wellbeing and experience of our research participants. Kat has previously worked in the NHS as a clinical studies officer across a wide range of different non-CTIMP study types and in Cardiff University as a trials manager in CTIMP studies. Prior to working in research, Kat trained as a genetic counsellor and previously worked in a variety of third sector organisations and in international development. So thank you, Kat, for being with us today. I'm going to hand over in just a moment, but there's a few webinars that we've got coming up that would just be useful to remind everyone of. So on 16th of October, we've got Dr. Kim Carter, and she's going to be talking about how a clinical trials unit can support the delivery of research projects. The following one is in December with Alicia Newman, talking about planning for and tracking patient and public involvement impact. And then the following one is in January with Dr. Zoe Hoare. Why do I need a statistician and what do they need from me? So some interesting topics coming up. There's more information on the website and details of how to register. So I will hand over to Kat. Kat will happily take questions, but if we can leave it to the end, that would be great. We are recording the session, but we won't record the questions at the end. All right, I'll hand over. Thank you, Kat.
Okay. So thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction. Thanks, Amanda. So welcome. Yes, so I'm talking about the upcoming changes to regulations around research involving human participants. A very catchy title. We chose this title because although a lot of the changes that are coming in are legally linked to drug studies, a lot of that content is likely to, well, it informs best practice with all study types, but it's likely to potentially also inform local policies, SOPs and things as well. So it covers all research involving humans, their tissue and their data. So the areas I'm going to look at, I'm going to look specifically at that good clinical practice update that's coming in that I'm guessing the majority of you are probably aware of here. I'm going to look at the UK clinical trial regulations. So that's the UK law on the medicines for human use regulations. And there's an update coming through to that. We'll also be looking at the upcoming update to the Declaration of Helsinki, and then I'll finish off by looking at the training that's available and how those updates are being incorporated into the training for you and your teams. And as Amanda said, if you've got any questions, if you can jot them down, I'll finish with plenty of time for lots of questions, so you can ask me any questions you've got. Although I realise I have a mix of people in the group as well, so I'm going to try as much as possible to avoid using any acronyms or any jargon. If I do say anything at any point that you're not quite sure what that stands for, what that is, do feel free to put that in the chat and I can, clarify that as I go through as well, just to make sure it's making sense to everyone there. Because if you don't know an acronym, there's probably someone else that doesn't. So I'm going to start off by looking at that good clinical practice, that GCP update. So currently in GCP, we're working on what's called the ICH E6R2. So I've gone straight in with an acronym after telling you about trying to avoid acronyms. The ICH just stands for International Council on Harmonisation. It's just the group of people that are trying to harmonise regulations around clinical trials. So it's just the group that make that decision. So we're currently on E6R2. Now, this was actually brought in quite recently, only in 2016. And it was brought in as almost like an addendum. So the original structure of the GCP regulations was maintained, and then addendums were added in to certain points. And it was brought in to try and make it a little bit more robust around electronic systems. Primarily, a lot of it was trying to make the language relevant to electronic systems, so we're still working to that exact same standard whether you're on hard copy or electronic, but also around quality management systems, a little bit around risk-based monitoring, and again increasing that emphasis on the protection of the people taking part in our research, which is the backbone of all research legislation. So that was E6R2 that we're on currently, and we're moving to E6R3. So this update has been brought in basically to just give emphasize the updates that are brought in R2, and it's to address, a lot of it is to address the application of GCP to different trial designs that are coming in. It's that recognizing that particularly since the pandemic, there have been a lot of changes in how studies are run, how studies are being designed, and the ICH want the GCP regulations to reflect that and to future-proof them almost, so that they are there and they are relevant, and they ensure that really robust practice across all different types of study design and delivery now and going forwards in the future. So I'm going to go over a little bit of information about them for you. So this is just giving you an overview of some of the changes that are in, and I should say at the moment they haven't been released, so they are still going through the different stages. So this isn't final, so I'm just giving you an overview of what's available. So a big part of what they're doing in their update is to incorporate new trial designs into the GCP regulations and make sure that's really robust. And when we're talking about new trial designs, we're specifically talking about complex and innovative designs. So some of you may be very familiar with that, some may not. It's essentially a very broad term that encompasses multiple different types of trial designs that don't really fit in with our standard randomized controlled trial design that we've used, for so long. That's that gold standard. So it might be, some of the style designs you might have come across. There's, I've worked on a few studies with a pick a winner design, where you can basically sort of change the different arms of the study depending on the data that's coming in, so you can be responsive to that. So it's kind of allowing that innovative design, so you can actually get, better data and respond to it. If there's one arm that's proving ineffective, that can be stopped. If there's one arm that's proving more effective or finding more data on there, then that could be explored more. So it's designs like that. So looking at those new trial designs and making sure the GCP regulations meet around that. But it's also looking at things around innovative trial delivery methods as well. So you might have a standard trial design, but there might be innovative delivery methods. So GCP is coming up to date with that. So you might be using a hybrid approach when you're working with your participants. You might be using data linkage, you might be using different electronic systems. So it's incorporating all of that into it as well. Various technological innovations, as I've mentioned, so they're coming in and they're going to continue to come in. So again, those updates to the regulations are there to try and reflect that and make sure it's, future-proof, and make sure it's robust, so that even if we're using these different innovative technologies, we're still applying those GCP principles in the same way. We're still protecting the right, safety and well-being of our participants, and we've still got that robust data of the highest quality. They're also advocating a proportionate approach, and this is something we've seen a lot in GCP over the last few years. Some of you may remember the joint statement that came out with MHRA and the HRA and the devolved nations around GCP training, and trying to advocate a proportionate approach to that. So it's a lot about trying to remove burdens. So historically, from the training perspective, I used to have, I once had a taxi driver in a training session because he had to deliver blood samples around Cardiff for a study, and someone in the study had decided he needed to have GCP training. So it's trying to make sure that's proportionate. But in the GCP regulations as well, it's trying to remove unnecessary burdens. So if you've got a low risk study, then you don't need as many measures in place. If you've got a high risk study, then you need far more measures in place to manage that. So it's looking at that proportionate approach, and you'll see this theme going on throughout. One of the changes that's likely to have more of an impact on you is just a language change. So the original GCP regulations talked a lot about essential documents. That's an official term. That's being changed to essential records. So that's something just to be aware of, because that might require local SOPs to be updated, sponsor policies, that kind of thing, just updating and amending that wording to reflect essential records when that's out. And basically that change is coming in place to recognise that, essential documents now refers a bit too much to hard copy versions. So it's recognizing there's multiple different kinds of these essential records that make up your site file and the information that will need to be viewed if you're inspected or monitored. There's also going to be a much greater risk emphasis on risk assessment. So this kind of links in with that proportionate approach as well. In the GCP is having a greater emphasis on that, but the MHRA have fed back to say they're going to have a much more of a focus on risk assessment, so that those studies with higher risk have much higher regulations in place, much higher measures in place, and those lower risk studies can continue to run to that high standard, but without it being a burden to manage those systems. So it's again about that proportionate approach and that risk. And in particular, and again, something that may have an impact on you at sites that we either individually, or we might need to look at this from a Wales perspective as well, is the MHRA are going to be asking for living risk assessments. So what they mean by that is, instead of having a static risk assessment at the start of a study, it's a living risk assessment that's continuously updated throughout the duration of that study, in response to any changes and things that come into place. And that's going to be something the MHRA have specifically said they're going to be looking for a lot in inspections as well. So that's a big request on their part. So that's something we probably need to think about on, do SOPs need to be updated? Are there likely to need to be new SOPs around that? Who's going to be responsible for doing that? What's the process? So there's likely to need to be conversations around that. But that's one of the key points that I picked up from those changes coming in there. Another change as well is that the new GCP that's coming in has been restructured. So when R2 was released, they actually kept the original structure of the original GCP principles and just added in addendums. But with R3, they're changing the structure to it. And this is where they've got two annexes. So they've got Annex 1, which is for interventional clinical trials, but there's a second annex for that additional consideration for non-traditional interventional trials. So that would be those that meet that complex and innovative design model there. And again, it's about trying to make that proportionate and make it easier for people to work to GCP standards. So if you're working on studies that meet the criteria under Annex 1, then you don't need to look at those additional considerations. But those that are working on those more complex designs, there's additional considerations for that. So it's that proportionate balance and that risk balance there as well to make it easier to work with those. This slide comes from the ICH website. So they've got I've put links in all of the slides there if you want to have a look at them to reference them. But where I can, I'll pop a link in the chat as well, and I'll see if I can get these circulated to you afterwards as well. So this just comes from the ICH website, and it's just showing the stages of the process for them to get the new regulations done. So currently steps 1 and 2 are completed, and we're in the middle of steps 3 and 4 at the moment. Now, the only guidance I've heard on this is that steps 3 and 4 are expected in autumn 2024. So that's the guidance that's been released. I don't know if that is happening or is about to happen or not. That's all that's been released at the moment. And they've also stated that Annex 2, that's the part for those more complex studies, will become available for public consultation soon. We don't know when. So the rest of it has already gone through public consultation, and then it's going to be going through regulatory consultation as well in these latter steps. So that's all we know about that at the moment. We haven't got any tight timelines, but we're going into these around this time period now before it goes into implementation. So it wouldn't be expected. There's no timelines that have been given on that, but we can't give any tight timelines on when to expect that coming through. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to look at the UK clinical trial regulations, and obviously these are heavily linked to the GCP, and the changes to GCP have been informing these as well. So the UK clinical trial regulations are it's the medicines for human use. So it's basically the UK law on how to conduct this. And it is, again, it's specific to drug studies, but a lot of it will apply and inform non-drug studies on best practice as well. So looking at that, so again, the guidance I've had on timelines, there's nothing concrete here. So what we've been specifically told is that they're due to be laid before Parliament in August. I don't know if that has happened yet or not. And the official statement we had from the HRA was that they've been working with the MHRA on this, and they wanted to lay the regulations before Parliament in the summer, and they hoped it would be ratified by the end of autumn with a possible implementation 12 months after. But this is open to change within about a year's time either side. So that's the timeline we've been given at the moment. Once it is in law, there will be an implementation period. So we've been told there will be that. So there'll be time to sort of make those changes and bring things into place. The key parts, and I'm going to go through all of these cuts. And again, for those that have just joined us, this is the UK clinical trial regulations that are legally what we follow in drug studies in the UK, but they will inform best practice for non-drug studies as well. So the key aims are to protect participants. So there's much more robust information on how we're protecting participants in our studies, how we can streamline regulation. So again, a lot of it is trying to make it easier to do research. And, the official line that they've given is they're trying to remove unnecessary burden whilst balancing that with making sure we have, that proportionate risk, and we've got that additional protection in place we need for those studies that meet that higher risk as well. And again, I've mentioned that proportionate risk-based approach. So that's a really key part that was echoed throughout a lot of GCP. So they're echoing it here, making sure that that is included in it and that risk assessments are a big part of it. So that's likely to be something because that's something the NIHR are very keen on. Those living risk assessments, we're likely to see something in the regulations around that as well. It's also aiming to have a little bit more robust guidance and best practice when working with electronic systems too. Okay, so you've got a little link at the bottom there. So this document is the proposal document. So I should stress that this is just the proposals. Again, it's not been ratified yet. So these are the proposals. Things may change, but I'm going to go over it and I'm going to do a light touch on each of the different proposals. If you want more information, again, you can ask questions at the end, but that document gives it in much more detail as well. So I've broken it down into those key areas. So the first one, which I think is very positive, is patient and public involvement. So currently, patient and public involvement is a REC, an ethics requirement for studies, but it's not written into law. So they want to bring that change in place to put that into law about patient and public involvement. So it just gives it that little bit more strength and robustness around that, which I think is a very positive thing. A proportionate risk-based approach. So this isn't a specific area in this document on policy, but it's echoed throughout the whole document about making sure we have that. And again, it's part of that measure to try and remove unnecessary burden to those simpler, lower risk studies. So it's easier to start them and run them, but also about making sure those that are higher risk have those tight measures in place. So we're still protecting that participant safety to the highest standards. There's also talk about research transparency. So historically, those of you working on drug studies, those of you who've been setting them up might be familiar with the UDRACT number. If you're not familiar with that, it's essentially a European database. If you're working on drug studies, that your studies were required to be listed on. And the idea was that if someone is running a study and they want to run a study in a particular area with a particular condition or treatment, they can look on the UDRACT database to see if it's already been done or what's been done in that area. So it avoids duplication. Obviously, post-Brexit, UDRACT is no longer going to be a legal requirement because it's a European database. So that will be replaced in the legislation with all drug studies will need an IRAS number, which they would do already anyway. But they're putting a proposal forward to suggest that all trials are registered on a World Health Organization compliant public register. So again, they're still maintaining that research transparency. There's a public register for them to be there to avoid, help researchers avoid unnecessary duplication. They also want to make it a requirement for findings of studies to be shared with participants within 12 months of a study ending, or a valid reason given as to why that's not possible. So that's probably something we need to have a think about when we're delivering or designing our studies, because currently a lot of study designs a lot of study plans don't necessarily take into account the time and the logistics involved in that. So, or a lot of it maybe need to be considered around the grant application stage as well to make sure there's funding to allow for that. So staff have the time to get those results out, but also there's considerations around how do we need to consent participants to give their details for us to hold them in order to share this information, or is it information we share on a website that they can access that way? What's the mode of that? So there probably need to be considerations and conversations around how that will be handled, and maybe some local SOPs or sponsor policies around how that will be managed as well. There's changes coming in, or proposed changes, I should say, around safety reporting. And again, this is one of those really detailed sections in that proposal document. So if you do work in pharmacovigilance, then have a look through that document. It will give you greater detail. But as a general overview, they want to simplify and reduce safety reporting requirements for SUSARs. So that's suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions, the most serious of adverse events in our studies, those that are serious, are related to the study, but we didn't expect that to happen. Currently, it's a requirement for sponsor to report that to MHRA and the Ethics Committee, and the proposal is to remove the need for them to report to the Ethics Committee, and the MHRA can be responsible for that liaising between the Ethics Committee where necessary. So again, it's part of that movement of trying to reduce the unnecessary burden. We're still reporting those SUSARs, we've still got that high quality, high safety measures in place, but it's reducing some of that duplication that was happening there with communication. And again, that's just a proposal at that stage. It may not go through. That's the proposal. And there's a few other proposals around that to try and reduce some of that duplication in reporting and the time spent around reporting SUSARs or safety events, and how to do that in a more streamlined, efficient manner, such as removing requirements for reporting of individual events to every single investigator, and that being something that's going through investigator brochures and so forth instead. They're also proposing a requirement for sponsors to have a safety reporting system. Now, they're not specifying what that is. Is that an electronic system? Is that, a person delivered system? What it is, they're just using the word safety reporting system, but they want it to be able to periodically review accumulating safety data in order to detect those safety signals early and then bring in risk mitigating actions. And they're specifically saying that should be risk proportionate. So those higher risk studies will be required to have, the sponsors will be required to have a more robust safety reporting system. Lower risk studies, it's proportionate to the risk in that study. So we're not quite sure what that's, the word in there doesn't go into much detail, but that's something, if you're in pharmacovigilance, to have a consideration around there as well. They're also proposing to make a change to some timelines. So again, for those of you in sponsor, there's currently a requirement if you put any urgent safety measures in place to give written notification to the MHRA within 3 days. That's going to be altered to 7 days to bring it in line with international guidance. They're still requiring those urgent safety measures to be put in place to protect the participants in that study. But they're just bringing that in line with the international guidance of 7 days. So it's just making it slightly easier for sponsors to manage that and work with that as well. So one of the other changes is they're looking at informed consent in cluster trials and how to simplify that. If you're not familiar with cluster trials, that's generally a study where instead of individual participants being randomized to different arms, a whole site might be randomized to one individual arm. So you might have participant A visits site A, and everyone at site A who takes part in the study receives treatment A, and everyone who goes to site B that takes part in the study receives treatment B. And so in those simpler study designs, they want to simplify that consent, particularly if someone is attending a site and they would be receiving that treatment or care anyway. They don't necessarily need to have the same lengthy consent process as someone who's in an early stage cancer drug study elsewhere. So it's about trying to, again, simplify that and make it proportionate if you've got lower risk studies, so it's more feasible for them to run and easier to recruit people in, so we can get them going more easily. There's also proposed changes to Ethics Committee review, which sounds a bit scary when you see it there, but they're essentially just making updates to the requirements for the makeup and minimum number of members. And they're going to update definitions around, or bring in definitions around lay members versus expert members, so that they can mirror those that are used internationally. So it's just bringing in those sort of definition changes there. And they're also going to be changing some of the wording that is deemed a little bit too prescriptive. They're proposing to say, refer to HRA guidance or policy where needed, again, to sort of, again, bring in that little bit of flexibility and that proportionate process for those lower risk studies. Clinical trial approvals processes. So again, they've put policies, they proposed changes to this as well, which again, it sounds like a very big thing. And there may be some of you who work in approvals who may have more knowledge of this than I do. So some of the changes, again, I'm just doing a light touch. If you want more information, that document has the proposals in much more detail. But currently, one of the changes they're bringing in is, at the moment, if you're working on a drug study, it's legally a requirement to submit apply for approval with the MHRA separately to applying for ethical approval, and they want to make that simpler so that actually legally there can be a combined review process for that for drug studies as well, so they're combined within that. And there is a combined review service they've been doing a trial of at the moment, and that's something they want to sort of see if they can build it on that system as well. They also want to streamline the way queries are made during that approvals process. So basically, if you're sponsor and you've put an approval in place, you've applied for approval for your to MHRA for that study, you can get those queries back as and when they come up rather than having to wait. So you can respond to them as well more quickly. So it makes it a little bit quicker and simpler to open those studies as well. And they also are proposing a different process for drug studies that are lower risk. So if that risk is similar to standard medical care available for that participant group, then there's a lower, a simpler process for applying. So again, it's making that slightly easier to get those studies start up and running, and it's that risk proportionate approach there. Those that are higher risk obviously will have to go through a more robust approvals process with the MHRA for that. They're making some updates as well, or they're proposing updates to some of the definitions in the study. So one of the key changes here is at the moment, the law still requires to subjects, still refers to subjects in our clinical trials, in our studies. So they're changing that to be participants, which is, you know, a very important ethical change because we don't subject people to our studies, they participate in them. So it's around that sort of ethical language there. They also want to add in some clarification around the role of sponsors and co-sponsors. And they're also updating some of the wording around consent to mirror what the Declaration of Helsinki says, so that it can say something along the lines of anyone on a trial team qualified by education, training or experience can receive consent of this study as detailed by the protocol, obviously. So they're mirroring the Declaration of Helsinki around there because it's that awareness that there are a lot of studies that are being run that it doesn't have to be consenting, depending on local policies, consenting by a medic. So they're updating that law to clarify that wording and mirror the Declaration of Helsinki. There's also a few changes coming in around manufacturing and assembling of investigational medicinal products. There's a bit more detail in that proposal document there, but it's things like updating wording and again using that risk proportionate approach. So they're bringing that into it as well. And they're also proposing changes to sanctions and corrective measures. So this again, it's adopting that risk-based proportionate approach. So things like if you have, so at the moment, a regulator can't see if a sponsor or an investigator has had serious non-compliance issues in another study. So they want to bring in proposals so that if someone is applying for approval for a new study, that regulator will be able to see they've had serious non-compliance issues elsewhere, and that may inform their decision. Now, that is specifically, it says specifically around the highest, non-compliance issues. So it wouldn't be around, struggling to recruit, would be around patient safety concerns, serious data concerns around that, so that it can inform that, because at the moment that's not in place. So it's providing that higher level of protection, but then also from that proportionate approach there, and being aware of the different types of trial design we've got now, they're proposing a suspension can be updated to reflect new trial designs. So for example, if there's one particular area of a study that has got issues in it, then that could be stopped and the rest of the study can continue running rather than having to close down the entire study. So they're changing or proposing to change the wording around that as well. So again, it's that proportionate approach to that study design. Okay, so I'm going to look now at the Declaration of Helsinki. So we'll go over that. And I've mentioned that a little bit already. That's already been referred to in the clinical trial regulations. So the Declaration of Helsinki, whilst it's not a legal document, it does set out the best practice. And it's considered the World Medical Association's best known policy statement. So it is an ethical document on how to conduct research, originally written in 1964. I think there's been 7 updates since then. The last one was in 2013. So this is the latest update coming from there. And again, although it's not a legal document, other legislation often refers to it or is informed by it. So as I mentioned, the clinical trial regulations in the UK are changing some of their wording to mirror what the Declaration of Helsinki says. So it informs that. And obviously, if you're on a non-drug study, the Declaration of Helsinki carries additional weight, because although you might not be following UK law, you're following the UK policy framework and you're following these ethical guidance as well. So it's given that more robust area there. So some of the things that they're updating, these are sort of the key bits that I've picked out of it. And again, we don't have a timeline yet for when this is coming out. I'm going to pop a couple of links in the chat for you now. So we've got one here from the World Medical Association. And this is just giving you a general overview of it. And then there's another link here from the HRA. And this is they reviewed the proposals for the updates to the Declaration of Helsinki. So this is just a document that's sharing some of the feedback and the comments they gave on it. So you can see the conversations that are happening. So the UK has had direct input into that. So they've updated language on consent. So specifically, they're emphasising that consent is not a one-off event. So the original wording wasn't as clear on that. And it's something we've been saying in the Health and Care Research Wales training programme from the dawn of the Health and Care Research training programme, that consent is an ongoing process. So it recognises that the actual formal consent documented process itself may occur over, it may be one session, it may be multiple sessions, depending on your participant and your study needs. But particularly, it's recognising that at every study visit, we are always checking the willingness to continue in the study. We're always checking and giving that opportunity for people to decline to take part or withdraw from the study, and having that documentation there. So it's a really clear update on that language to make sure that process is seen rather than that one-stop shop. They're also changing from the term subjects to participants. So obviously the UK legislation is mirroring that as well. So again, that's the Declaration of Helsinki informing it there. They're changing, they refer to a lot in the original Declaration of Helsinki, they refer to the physician a lot. So they're changing that to include or other appropriately qualified individuals, because it's recognising there's a lot of studies out there that aren't being run by medics. So it's recognising that and bringing up to date. It includes as well reference to promoting sustainability and reducing research waste. So again, that ethical consideration around that, which is something that informs our best practice, and maybe something that we can look at from locally, how that can be, improved. And also it lists social value as a primary purpose of research. So it's updated that to look at that social value outcome of it as well, which is a really positive move from that. Okay, so I'm just going to have a little look at training, just so you know what training is available and how that is being updated around this. So as Health and Care Research Wales, we work with the NIHR to develop and review GCP training resources. I myself am on several working groups with the NIHR to review on that, and the MHRA gives direct input to that. So any of our combined, we work in collaboration with the NIHR, any of those GCP training programs, you can be assured that it's the, very robust information that the MHRA gives direct input to on what they want covered in that. The e-learning at the moment, the GCP e-learning on NIHR Learn will be updated to reflect any changes as they come in. And there is a new GCP refresher that's being developed at the moment with the NIHR in collaboration with ourselves. And that will include the most up-to-date information on legislation as well. So just some of those courses that are available and how these updates in legislation may be communicated to teams. So on NIHR Learn, these are the e-learning courses available to everyone. They've got the GCP Introduction, which is the required GCP Introduction e-learning, and the GCP Refresher. That is currently the only GCP Refresher that's available, but we're expecting a facilitator-led option coming out next year. So these don't have the updates in at the moment, but there's plans for them to be updated to reflect on that. GCP Fundamentals, so if you have staff in your team who don't require full GCP, but they need an oversight if they're working in pharmacy or labs, that will be updated to include any information around that as well. And they also run specialist consent modules around adults lacking capacity or working with paediatrics. So again, that will be updated to reflect any of the upcoming changes around that. And additional information on electronic consent modes as well. And then has Health and Care Research Wales, we run a range of facilitator-led courses. So the good clinical practice ones are obviously developed with NIHR Learn, and then we deliver them as part of the GCP programme for England and Wales. So we run that GCP consolidation, which is for those that have done their introduction e-learning and they want that little bit more information. And again, our facilitators will be kept up to date on all of the latest information so they can share that with people doing that. Valid informed consent, that's kept up to date again with those regulations, so that will be kept, reflecting those changes. Principal investigator workshop, again, will be keeping up to date with those regulations and the requirements as a PI. And as I mentioned, we are currently working with the NIHR on a new GCP refresher that's facilitator led, and your team, although at the moment there's only an e-learning available, researchers will be able to choose to complete either the e-learning or the facilitator led, whatever is best for them and their needs. and that will have ongoing up-to-date information on it, so facilitators can deliver that to keep people up to speed on any regulation changes when they're coming in, and timeline guidance on that. So it will be relevant, so any training will keep that up to speed for teams. Thank you very much. So I've put some of the links here as well, and I'll see if I can get them circulated to you afterwards if anyone's interested in that. In particular, there's a really useful blog written by the NIHR that goes into a lot of detail on they've reviewed the E3 proposals, so it goes into a lot of detail on that. So I'll just put that in the chat box for you as well, so you can have a read, and it gives a very detailed overview of it all. If anyone has any questions, I'm open to answer them now.